Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is a fantastic game. It combines fun, thoughtful and engaging gameplay with a compelling character-driven story in a pre-established universe already thick with all the necessary lore to understand it. Complete with the awesome iconic Star Wars soundtrack, albeit altered to provide Jedi Fallen Order some identity, and the gorgeous graphical beauty that you will see on screen. I absolutely loved playing this game, end to end. Something I definitely did not expect considering this was an EA game, though I could quickly find myself forgetting about that and thinking of it only as a product by Respawn Entertainment. So I thought I'd give my review of this game since it managed to captivate me to finish it through binge playing, something I rarely find myself able to do these days. This is a special game, so here's my review of Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. On the story front, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order functions as something of a personal tale for our ginger protagonist Cal Kestis. I have to say that he's ginger because somehow that's relevant. Soulless bastard. On a serious note, I saw a review by IGN that made mention of it, and honestly, man's just got red hair, leave him be. Now, while there are some stakes in the plot, they are only really what keeps driving Cal forward, explaining why he's doing what he is. Basically, he's on the hunt for a holocron containing information on the whereabouts of Force-sensitive children across the galaxy, in order to obtain the information before the Empire does, with the hopes of rebuilding the Jedi Order. Now, we know this doesn't happen from the start because of the original trilogy in which Luke Skywalker is the only Jedi who appears to still be kicking about, sticking his big pointy lightsaber to the Empire. Barring Obi-Wan Kenobi and Master Yoda, who are both old men that die, so they don't really count. Then you've got Ezra Bridger from Rebels, who's just buggered off with the space whales, so I guess it's just a Jedi tradition, for the most part, to contribute absolutely nothing to anything worthwhile. Anyways, the plot is character-driven, not just with the protagonist, but the characters around him, such as Cal's crew on the Mantis, Sira Junda, a former Jedi Knight who has since cut herself off from the Force, who functions as something of a mentor figure to Cal. Grease Dorito. Greased Ritus, he's a strange four-armed space weasel rabbit thing they call a Latero. He functions as the captain of the Mantis, piloting it, often using his favourite line that I cannot make heads nor tails of.
Grab some seat.
It must be a Latero dialect thing, but honestly, I don't know. Then of course there's BD-1, Cal's droid buddy with the legs of a chicken and the demeanour of a curious puppy, who essentially helps him in various ways while exploring the world's spaces. If you need to open an overly futuristic door, BD-1's your boy. If you need to overcharge a zip wire to move it into an accessible position, BD-1's your boy. If you need to taser Darth Vader in order to escape certain death, this little droid's an absolute nutcase. Not sure I want to test that last one more than once though, to be honest. Later in the game you run into another crew member, the Night Sister Merrin, which I first saw in the subtitles and misread as Merlin, and then on rereading, Melon. She's a Night Sister, which means she's technically a Force user, using the Force in a way known as magic in Star Wars lore, which is unknown to Jedi nor Sith. Correct me if I'm wrong. And she only really shows up towards the end of the game. The crew members develop to trust Cal as Cal develops to trust them, creating a bond between them by the end that wasn't there at the start, meaning that it's not only just a story about Cal's development, where everyone else is a stationary and stale object, this is a story where most characters see some development from how we find them to how we leave them. Barring of course lesser important characters who do not need this because they're not a part of the crew and they only show up once. As far as antagonists go, you have the second sister, who has her own development going on, which I did not expect, especially considering most of the time in a lot of games and movies and TV shows, the villain finds himself simply being an immovable object. Then there's the ninth sister, who I also like to call Darth Big Mac. She's more the brute secondary antagonist that doesn't really have a scope of the big picture and is just in it to kill you. She may not have the most in-depth development going, however she does deliver one hell of a good moment.
It's over. Being an Inquisitor taught me no setback is too great. When you've already lost yourself, a limb's easy. You know, I was a Jedi. It'd be fun to bring you in. Watch you crack like the rest of us! Oh, angers you. Just wait till the isolation, torture, mutilation, and your breath! I won't let you touch them! You can't stop the Empire!
I can stop you.
Defeating the Ninth Sister shows in Cal's confidence later in the game, which is a massive development for him. So while the Ninth Sister doesn't have a fleshed out story of her own really in this game, she is in other comics and things as well, remember. She does play a solid role as a midway boss for Cal Kestis in his own development. The second sister definitely has deeper development, though I find it's a bit too predictable for my taste.
When the purge started and our clone troops turned against us, my Padawan and I took several younglings and we went into hiding, but we didn't last long. Imperial Patrol was about to discover our location, so I tried to lure them away from my Padawan Trilla. She stayed behind with the younglings.
Your Padawan. Did she survive?
No.
The answer is yes. She's the second sister.
But that's why we can't give up.
Sarah was never good at keeping secrets. Cracked in an Imperial torture chair. Surrendered the location of her naive Padawan. They would never have found me.
If it wasn't for her, she betrayed me.
Trilla.
In the flesh.
If this wasn't the plot twist from the original Star Wars movies, I'd be impressed. Though I'd be lying if I said I didn't think it was well enough handled that I enjoyed it just the same. Though I will say this, considering her voice, going into the game I half expected her to remove her helmet to reveal a Dunmer from Skyrim. Just gave me that vibe, I guess. The game also sees a couple of returning characters from other Star Wars material, such as Saw Gerrera, a ruthless rebel so extreme that even other rebel cells dislike him, which is a cool inclusion we could see coming due to him being present in promotional content, such as the gameplay demo shown back in June, so though it wasn't a surprise, it was cool that it was in the game nonetheless. Then of course you've got a brief Darth Vader moment right at the very end, whose helmet made me think of the Lego Star Wars version of him for some reason. Of course, this is a well-structured ending point that really highlights that in the grand scheme of things, Cal's story isn't significant, nor should it be, and draws the focus to Cal's character development where it belongs. My only argument against this being there's only so many times that you can have Vader show up right at the very end just to ruin the party before it gets a bit stale. That being said, this moment was genuinely terrifying as it would be for Cal, and I'd argue that this scene is actually necessary, as over the course of the game during Cal's progression he's been getting stronger as a Jedi, but as Qui-Gon Jinn puts it in The Phantom Menace, there's always a bigger fish, and is meant to tell us that there's no surprise really as to why Cal was no help at all during the original trilogy when Luke Skywalker and his own swashbuckling crew was sticking it to the Empire. Of course, Cal's development leads him to conclude that his intervention would undoubtedly put the lives of all Force-sensitive children whose locations were marked by the Holocron in some serious peril, thus leading him to destroy the Holocron, concluding to trust only in the Force, as only the Force can decide these children's destinies, calling back to the Force vision he had of his master right at the very start of the game.
Apprentice, mark well and listen.
Master.
Trust only in the Force.
Making Cal's entire development a very neatly done thing. Unlike that sentence, might I add. Other cool parts of Cal's story include flashbacks to his life as a Jedi Padawan as a child, learning under his Lasat Master Jedi Jaro Tapal, even showing us where Cal was and what he was doing during the fateful Order 66, and how he survived and escaped the Jedi Purge. Showing us how Cal got his master's lightsaber. It's a very powerful moment in the game because one moment you're running through the halls of a ship high-fiving the clone troopers, and only moments later they're hunting you down with the intent to kill you. You can also really feel Cal's pain when his master is killed, at which point Cal is given his master's lightsaber, which, soon after having the flashback, he has another vision of his former master, in which he actually breaks it, which forces him on a quest to build a new one, which is, by the way, another awesome scene. Hell yeah. Naturally, of course, in gameplay you proceed to use this lightsaber to cut up everybody, complementing Cal's character development with his physical development, and it's honestly awesome. As you probably know, as the only reason why I can imagine you've watched a spoiler review is because you've played the game and you want to know what other people are thinking of it, there are plenty of moments in this game that make up for an amazing story. And it's not too long or too short either, stacking up between 10 and 20 hours of gameplay and story content altogether, depending on how rapidly you decide to play through it. But I think we've done enough talking about the story, and it's time that we went on to talk about something else finally, and that is of course going to be the gameplay. Gameplay wise, Jedi Fallen Order is satisfying, responsive, engaging, fast paced and not at all clunky. The lightsaber combat feels great, though it takes some getting used to in order to master it, and I'm far from being able to do that, being an unrepentant button-mashing maniac. The combat requires you to think, wait, and time your parries and attacks in order to avoid incoming damage and deal damage most effectively, as missteps and openings will cause your enemy to gain an advantage, which can turn to death rather quickly, which is where this game has garnered comparisons to Souls games, though I'd argue it's nowhere near that severe. With all the different enemy types, you're forced to adapt your combat technique with every fight. Say regular stormtroopers take no effort to kill, but almost every other enemy type will give you a hard time if you don't combat them in the right way that yields less openings for them and gives you the best advantage. In most one-on-one situations, swinging your lightsaber like a maniac is usually enough, though when fighting bigger enemies, purge troopers, bosses or groups of enemies, you're forced to adapt and apply genuine tactical thought into considering how to take your foes down. I love slicing my way through the combat with my gorgeous customized lightsaber, which has plenty of customization options, making it perfect considering you'll spend so long using it and seeing it that you might as well change its colour at the very least to suit you more. I personally opted for the green lightsaber in the early game, where Cal's still using his master's old lightsaber. I did wonder at this point if other colours would become available, and I was delighted to find out that other colours did in fact show up when Cal makes his own later in the game. And of course from there on out the colour was non-negotiably purple. What I found super cool that was after unlocking the double-bladed lightsaber later in the game, you can switch between using the single and double blade by the press of a button, and can apply these switches to your fighting techniques with the correct skills and perks, which you can either do with a really powerful attack or just by switching with the button for cool effect. I noticed the dual blade really does make a difference when facing an onslaught of enemies that just doesn't seem to end, as you can do damage to several enemies at once if you really wanted to. On the front of the skill tree, it's more like a skill graph, giving you extra health and force as well as adding new skills for you to use in combat using the skill points you frequently acquire during your progression through world spaces. You never become an absolute powerhouse because the game focuses on trying to challenge you as the player, but these skills are incredibly useful, and if you don't invest in any upgrades, your life is going to be a lot harder. The platforming is another massive part of gameplay and is often infused in puzzles. You spend a lot of time climbing, wall running and jumping from A to B, meaning you need to be aware of your surroundings sometimes, otherwise you'll find yourself falling to your death where you'll respawn to try again. Puzzles can take some thinking. They're not simple at the best of times, requiring you to think and sometimes just give up and Google it because it's something you'll never think of, due to either being too obscure or too simple. No puzzle in this game is exceptionally hard or annoying, it's just a case of you have to figure it out. Sometimes your puzzles will require you to use your force skills as well, and will usually be combined with a bit of platforming and combat. There's enough variety in here for the puzzles to not get boring, so there's not much to complain about. The world design is structured in a way so all world spaces can be explored in a less linear fashion, despite the game being mostly linear in what it's doing. There's plenty of secrets to find, with which Cal's force ability to experience past events just by touching an object associated with them provides plenty of database information and stories to inhabit the world with. Then there's the crates in which you can find lightsaber parts, clothing, gear, ponchos which mostly don't float my boat, and paint jobs for BD1 and the Mantis for some reason. I don't know how many times I've opened a box to see a car colour change, but fair enough. And then there are workbenches where you can acquire upgrades for your droid, and at one point, a double-bladed lightsaber. It's these little things that makes the exploring worthwhile. Now at times I find the world design can be a little bit confusing, however on the map you can access through BD1, you know where to go, but sometimes there'll be no clear path unless you've been there before, meaning you have to explore your way from end to end, which is part of the fun, encouraging you to explore a bit, though at times this can get a bit confusing as I did say, but it's nothing to worry about, and ultimately, as there are shortcuts you can find to quickly head back to re-find the path if you lose it, it shouldn't be too much of a big deal. Of course, then you have your ship, the Mantis, which you can use to travel to different planets. Grease will then fly you there and leave you to wait around for about a minute or so listening to your crew's dialogue, which may or may not be relevant before finally arriving at your desired destination. There's not too much worth doing in this time barring waiting for the next world space to load in, listening to the dialogue, maybe saving the game or adjusting your lightsaber parts, colour or material to make it more true to your style of play. But that's all it needs to be. Once landed on planets, you can interact with your crew who will all be stood outside of your ship. They'll have some insight for you as well as conversations that can shed some light on them as characters and highlight their development at times. For example, at the start if you try to interact with Grease, usually you will get quite blunt responses, but towards the end of the game they become more open. Saving the game works through meditation spots where you can rest to regain health stims that you'll need to heal, as well as return to max health on top of that, at the expense of all enemies in the vicinity respawning. You can also just touch and go with these locations and save the game and respawn there the next time you die, and access the skill graph from here so you can apply your skill points. So if you see one of these, always interact with them even if you don't do anything but leave straight afterwards. Sometimes you can go for a while without seeing these and you may die. If that happens, you will respawn back at the last save point that you were at, and will have to retrace your steps all the way back to where you were, though most story moments save on their own, so you'll just have to retrace your steps and that's it. In order to regain your experience points and things, you will need to in fact attack the enemy that killed you last, which shouldn't be too difficult as you'll know exactly where they are and how to get back to them. Though this system ultimately might seem punishing, once you know how to get from A to B it shouldn't really take too long. Force gameplay is relatively limited to push, pull and slowing things down. However, when you're actually using it, it feels way more expansive because you can apply it in creative ways, such as pulling an enemy towards you to strike them, slowing them down to strike them, or to heal yourself with a health stim, or pushing them off of a ledge. There's also pulling objects to grab hold of them and use them to swing, for example, or pushing objects to move them, or slowing down pieces of a puzzle in order to continue along with it. And honestly, I don't know what else they'd want to do in the gameplay beyond that. What do you want to have, a force wank? Another cool thing is of course the subtitles with the non-basic speaking characters, as Star Wars lore puts it, such as droids like BD-1 or Wookiees. Whoever wrote those subtitles needs a promotion because they're great fun to read. And the icing on the cake is what's read doesn't sound even remotely close to what's said. That rhymed, and it scares me, but it's perfect. It makes me wonder, when my dog barks or even breathes intensely, what would his subtitles be? Why is he so resistant to the food technique, though? Come on! It's a chip! On the visuals front, the environmental design is stunning. From the dense foliage of Kashyyyk to the desolate waste look of Dathomir under its intense red sun, or the snowy expanses of Ilum. Each world looks unique with differing terrain, lighting and structure, making each planet in this game memorable. And that's honestly the way that you want it to be. If every planet looked the exact same and felt the exact same, it would be kinda dull. But thanks to the visuals being so vastly different between all the different locations, you know which planet you're on just by looking at what's presented on screen. For the most part, character models look great too, well defined and kinda bog standard beyond this. And that's all they need to be. There are some moments where certain models look a bit janky, like Sirajunda on the lighting of Bogano for some reason to me is a tragedy. And don't even get me started on the fucking Wookiees. But beyond that, everything else is fine. The blade of a lightsaber has a satisfying finish, though it's just a stick of light with a colour emitting from it, and there's not really much else to say about that one. But you get my point. From a graphical standpoint, there's really not too much to complain about, besides the Wookiees. That is one of my few miscellaneous nitpicks. I'm going to go through the list now. One thing I firmly believe that Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is sorely missing is a hub world area dedicated specifically to downtime that is not the ship, attaching you properly to the Star Wars universe and contrasting that lonely feeling of Cal's life as a Jedi post Order 66 Imagine the sounds, visuals and activities of a planet on the map dedicated specifically to shops where you can purchase specific materials and so on. I understand why this wasn't a priority, but I think it would have been a solid way to consolidate the Star Wars atmosphere and give you that warm fuzzy feeling of proper connection to the rest of the Star Wars universe. The best example of what I could probably give as to what it would be like the Citadel in Mass Effect 3. An area dedicated to interacting with characters, shopping for equipment that you need, maybe even throw in an arena-like area, complete with a cantina with these weird aliens playing some nice old jizz. Yep, I'm fully aware of the other definition of jizz. Most people do it into socks every night. I go for gloves. Moving on, another complaint of mine is the lack of humanoid mutilation outside of cutscenes. You can mutilate robots and animals, but for some reason you can't people. Even though some kill moves present in the game would certainly cut a man clean in half. And it's not like Star Wars mutilation is particularly gory anyway, considering how a lightsaber works, so there's no real reason why they shouldn't put this in there. Moving on, BD1 appears to have an understanding of the Force as well. Since it comes up as bloopity bleepity conversations with Cal on occasion, I thought canonically droids couldn't have any understanding nor capability of understanding the Force. Please correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't want to be unfair to the game. Another nitpick I have, which is kind of funny really, as when you're at your ship landed on a planet's surface, your crew will be stood outside. You can head over and interact with them, though some interactions will seem like they should be doing something else while they're talking about it. For example, Grease is always talking about cooking, and the best of the lot, pressing the interact button only for him to shout occupied like he's sat on the toilet, but instead he's just stood there like a crazy man. I think having the crew interact with things as opposed to standing around idling would make for a much more immersive experience anyway, and considering some of the dialogue, I'd imagine that's what they intended to do but never got around to doing it. My next complaint is the second sister boss fight is a tease, because you have this boss fight like 4 times, and in the first 3, you don't deplete her health bar beyond half. I think a bit more variety in how you engage the second sister in these fights would have made for a much more pleasurable experience than just scrapping her on a level field over and over again. But considering that these encounters have a huge impact on the overall story, I think it's worth letting slide because the story's that good. And when you finally defeat her, it's a sweet moment. Another little nitpick is of course the Wookiees. I have had literal nightmares over these Wookiees, man. Another thing I have noticed is the game loads in areas rather instantly as opposed to gradually. So you'll be moving through one area and you'll reach the end before heading into the next, and instead of loading as you go, the game will then freeze and render that next world space for a few moments. This is slightly on the unusual side, but it's not that big of an issue. It just gets in the way a little bit sometimes and can be a little bit annoying. But if that's what the technology demands, that's what it demands. Though in future I'd probably recommend looking for a way around that one. Though I'm certain I don't need to say that for them to know it. Moving on from my little nitpicks, on the front of the promise of no microtransactions and things, I'm pleased to say for once that EA was true to their word. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order as of right now features no in-game purchases of cosmetic items, XP boosts, or any other means to exploit players who have already bought the game. As far as EA goes, this may as well be a sign of the end times. As far as technical issues are concerned, bugs and glitches aren't too common. There are a few moments of jankiness, such as a cutscene shot cuts causing a bit of flicker, and as far as glitches go, I've run into a few moments in gameplay where a glitch will cause you to fall to your death, or do something unexpected and then fall to your death. Oh, for fuck. What the fuck are you... But in video games, especially considering how massive they are now, bugs and glitches are unavoidable, so there's not a problem with that. I've not run into anything properly game-breaking or anything like that, so I can't really complain. On PS4, I can't really say anything about frame drops as I didn't notice any, though I'm sure in a few areas they certainly probably did drop a few frames, as all games tend to do this here and there. And then of course that brings us to the PC performance. On the highest settings available, I managed to get a decent 60 frames per second for the most part, barring a few instances where I'd see significant frame drops. though I doubt that's an issue with optimization, as barring my graphics card, I'm dealing with a rather dated system. So the game doesn't appear to be too intensive all in all you need is an agreeable system and the game will run fine. Before you stoop to the comments to shit on my system, I'm sure I'll upgrade it soon enough, probably wind up replacing the entire machine at this point because it's getting on a bit and there's a lot that needs changing, so please note that getting a new rig is on my to-do list, but it's not anything that's going to happen in the next couple of months, at the very least might I add. But back on the topic of PC performance, there's no real issue there. I don't see a poor optimization, I see a very solid one. In conclusion, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is an excellent swashbuckling space adventure set in the Star Wars universe in which we follow Cal Kestis' path to self-discovery and acceptance of his role in life as a Jedi post-Order 66. With great side characters and a quality antagonist, the gameplay feels great, responsive and varied enough that you'll never get bored, combined with some gorgeous graphics and a lovely old Star Wars soundtrack complements it all nicely. It's not a perfect game, however, it surely does set the bar high for EA Star Wars games going forward. Respawn Entertainment did an awesome job with this game and deserves all the praise possible for it, but I'd be lying if I said this was the quality I'd expect going forward from EA Star Wars games. That being said, this is certainly the new standard that EA should refer to when making not just Star Wars games, but any game going forward, and we know they certainly won't be doing that, will they? Screw Battlefront 3, nobody wants that. Nobody wants a half-baked microtransaction exploitation factory first-person shooter with no depth and misleading selling points. Give us these more personal, story-driven Star Wars games with rich worlds and plenty to do, please. You could even do a bounty hunter game. We won't stop you. In fact, we'd probably play it. All we can hope is that this is the start of a new chapter for EA Star Wars games, even if that is a little on the naive side. I love Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. It's one of the best Star Wars games I've played, right up there with KOTOR and the LEGO games. And I am, though reasonably compelled to feel a need for restraint, looking forward to finding out what the future holds for Star Wars games. Is it a bright future or a dim one? I guess only time will tell. Anyways, that concludes today's video, which has been a review on Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, so thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends and all that wonderful stuff. I'd really appreciate it. Maybe consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com/FishyYarpster. Please don't ask about why that link is called that. I honestly do not have an answer for you. And get access to extra content, including a script draft for this video. Oh god, I just looked at the length of it. This is going to make my PC scream for death. And I will of course see you all very soon with another video at some point.